Today I want to talk some about the whole idea of worldview. At TMS Global, we like to make sure that all of our workers, especially those working cross-culturally, are well-versed in cultural issues that'll make them more effective in ministry. Well, worldview is a fundamental concept here. Now, we hear worldview tossed around a lot by different news organizations, talking about this and that about worldview. I want to get to the more technical definition of what a worldview is. Worldview basically is what you see as normal. It's what I see as normal. Worldview is that set of assumptions based on reality, based on my upbringing, the set of assumptions I bring that I perceive reality. So worldview exists in my head, but it's a reflection of what I've seen around me. Now, the trick is that worldview is almost all subconscious. When we think about cultures and stuff, we often think about the dance, the language, the music, and that all is part of culture. It's all a reflection of worldview, but is at the surface. If you kind of picture a big iceberg and think of culture as an iceberg, at the very top is where you see the behavior, you actually see the culture. But the bulk of culture is under the surface, and at the very bottom of that is worldview. It's those basic sets of beliefs and assumptions that you don't even question, it's just normal. So why does this matter? Well, it really doesn't matter much as long as you're in a single culture where everybody shares that same worldview. We learn worldview from our parents, we learn from our teachers, we learn from our community and our friends. So we share the same worldview and we all have the same assumption of what is normal. Problem happens if you drop yourself into another culture where there is a different worldview, a different set of assumptions. All of a sudden the worldview you have, what is normal to you, isn't normal. Now some things are obvious. For example, in my worldview, the proper way for two men to greet each other is to shake hands. The proper way for a man to greet a woman is to shake hands. If we know each other well, maybe give a little hug. Well, then I go to another culture where the proper way for two people to greet each other is to give each other two kisses. The challenge with worldview is a lot of it is subconscious things we don't know. We just feels different. It feels wrong. You can liken it to a GPS. I live in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, so I've got a map that tells me how to get around Atlanta, Georgia. And it works for me. It tells me where to turn left, which road is one way, what to do at the stoplight. If I take that same map that works in Atlanta, Georgia and drop it in New York City, it's not gonna do me any good. I'm gonna go the wrong way on one-way streets. I'm gonna make a turn in the wrong place. There's probably not even a Peachtree Street to be seen. That's because the map I had for Atlanta isn't working in New York City. The same thing happens with worldview, is you take this set of assumptions, you drop into another culture and things are different. People act differently. We may assume people are bad people, or people are uncultured, or whatever else, or uncivilized, simply because they have a different worldview than we have. So understanding worldviews is especially important if we're going to work or be in ministry cross-culturally. We have to have the tools first to recognize our own worldview. What are the values that I assume are just the way things are? We need to understand, how do those relate to the Bible? Are they from the Bible, or are they just simply neutral things that because I grew up in North America, this is what I think is normal? And then as we go to another culture, how do we have the tools to begin to discern their worldview, how it contrasts to ours, and then adjust our own behavior, our own thoughts, our own ways of being, so that we can function well in their worldview. And then when it comes to ministry, where this really matters for the kind of work that TMS Global does, is we want to make sure the gospel is able to transform my worldview as well as transform the worldview of any place I go. So we begin to look at the worldview and say, in what areas is the gospel saying, this is amazing, this is the way it should be? Respect for elders, for example, is in many worldviews that is not so strong in my own worldview. Well, that's a thing the gospel absolutely affirms, and we can affirm. On the other hand, if I go into another culture, there may be things in the worldview that really the gospel would challenge. For example, if women are not valued in a culture. And the fact is, a good chunk of worldview is just the gospel is neutral on. For example, I don't eat insects. I think that's gross. But for another culture, that is considered totally normal. Well, that's a complete worldview assumption. Is it normal to eat insects or not normal? That's not a value assumption. That's not Christian or not Christian. That's just different. And in fact, that often is what makes crossing cultures interesting and fun, is trying those things or learning those things that are just simply different and even might be endearing about another culture that's different. Now, one way the worldview is sometimes thrown around that I have to admit I really struggle with is the idea of a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview. And in fact, if you dig beneath the surface, often, if that's said in the American context, what it's really meant is an American worldview. The gospel is always expressed through culture. It's always expressed through worldview. And so there is a biblical worldview. Well, actually, there's multiple biblical worldviews because the Bible covers several cultures and several centuries. But let's look at the worldview of Jesus. There was a worldview of first century Jewish occupied Palestine. They had a worldview, and when the gospel came in, it began to be expressed in the early church through that worldview. And so the goal is not so much to say, I'm going to have a biblical worldview, but it's to say, how does the Bible influence my worldview in a way that expresses the reality of God through my culture? And the beauty of that is, as I have my worldview, and including my blind spots as well as my strengths, and then I build a relationship with a brother or sister in Christ who has a different worldview, different blind spots, different strengths. As we come together, we get a truer expression of who God is. And that's why the global church is so exciting, because as all these different cultures learn about God, they dig into the Bible through their own cultural lenses, and they compare with other cultures. As we bring all that together, we get a much fuller picture, more accurate picture of the beauty of God and the infinite grace of God. The implications of this understanding of worldview are pretty profound for mission work, because that means that before I can go and start sharing the gospel and understanding how does it express in this culture, I need to go and I need to learn what that worldview is. I need to learn what are the questions they're asking. So often in mission, we often go with answers to questions that people aren't even asking. So I've got to first learn the culture, have a learning posture to say, what is it that's going on in this culture? What are the questions people are asking? What are the issues? And how does the gospel connect with that? That's why we believe so strongly in training at TMS Global. We want to make sure our people don't just understand this stuff about worldview, but they have the tools to go in and discern what a worldview is, discern their own worldview, and begin to understand how does change happen, how does culture happen, and how does the gospel begin to fit in to this new culture.